Well, we're living in a moment in Christian history where lots of people are wrestling with all kinds of questions about their faith. And in some cases, they're saying, I don't think I want to stay a part of this Christian faith. There's a lot of that going on in our culture. And so we've been talking in this series about what I've been calling some of the, not every question people are debating these days, but some of the underlying questions. We're taking a look at 4 of the underlying questions that maybe are really rocking people and causing them to question in a way that they maybe never have before in their Christian journey. And so this morning, the question I want to explore is this: have many Christians become too judgmental? Now, I'm putting it in the form of a question, but I think for a lot of people it's really more of a sentiment. And what they would say is they would say, yes, lots of Christians in our culture have become too judgmental. I hear that from people all the time. I especially hear it actually from younger generations. Now, I realize that as soon as you raise this question about judgment, the main pushback will be other Christians saying that you have to make judgments because there's a difference between good and evil. And if you aren't calling it out, if you aren't warning people, then you're part of the problem because you're not telling people what they need to hear about these things. But then on the other hand, and there's validity to that, but then on the other hand, and we'll look at this, we have Jesus giving us some very direct warnings about judging. So this morning, I want to explore this a little bit because I think this has been a confusing piece of terrain for people on a Christian journey. Like, on the one hand, yes, we have to figure some things out. We have to figure out what the deal is with good and evil, with healthy and unhealthy, all these things. We've got to figure this out and make choices. But on the other hand, Jesus is warning us about kind of what we do with that. So, there are questions like, are we not supposed to judge at all? Are there certain times it's right to make judgments about people's sin? If we never judge, are we being soft on sin? These are good questions. And of course, we can't just eject the whole concept of judgment from Christian faith because ultimately, there is good and evil. There are good ways to live and there are unhealthy and harmful ways to live. There is darkness and there is light. And that is the purpose of Jesus coming. Jesus said that if you follow me, you won't walk in darkness, that he came to lead us out of darkness and into the light. So we can't just dismiss all that. So if you asked me, does God have the right to say what is good and bad in our lives, to tell us if we're guilty or not, and what we should do about that? My answer is absolutely. As Hebrews 4:13 says, there is no creature hidden from his sight, but all things are bare and open before him to whom we must give account. And I would also say that since good and evil, healthy and unhealthy, helpful and harmful are real distinctions, that part of the Christian journey for me is going to be that I have to work the process of distinguishing between those things, right? So there are lots of places, for example, in the Apostle Paul's letters in the New Testament, where he talks about how the Holy Spirit helps us to discern what is from God and what is not from God. And in his Galatian letter, for example, many of you are familiar with this passage, he gives us a list of the fruits of fearful and selfish living. That's the way I would put it. He calls them the fruits of the flesh, of the works of the flesh. And he lists all these terrible things that we do and that we do to each other, basically. But then he gives us this list of the fruit that comes when we let God dwell in us and move in us and work in us. The fruits of the Spirit's work in us. And that list is things like love and joy and peace and patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control. My point is that we are to be learning the difference and letting the things that are truly good grow in us. So we got that settled, right? We are to be learning the difference between what's good and bad and healthy and harmful and all that kind of stuff. The question is this: with our growing understanding, if we're on this Christian journey, we have this growing understanding of these things. The Holy Spirit's helping us discern, we're growing in wisdom, all these things. As we experience that, and we discern the difference between good and evil, healthy and unhealthy, darkness and light, what do we do with that as we then look out at the lives of other people, or as we look out at the culture and the world around us? I think it's healthy to acknowledge that most of us have or have had a temptation to take what we think is our very good bead on what's good and bad and use it as a basis for casting judgment on others. Maybe you've never done that. I have. And I think it would be a mistake not to acknowledge or to be dismissive of Jesus' very strong warnings cautioning us about this very thing. So let's be radical this morning and let's just let Jesus tell us something. Let's not be defensive with Jesus and say, yeah, but Jesus, I got this verse over here about judgment. I got this verse, Lord, blah, 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 Let's just hear what Jesus says about this and wonder about it. Are you in? Okay. All right. So what I want to read to you is just a few short verses from Matthew chapter 7. This is in the Sermon on the Mount. And this is what Jesus says. Judge not, lest ye be judged. For with the judgment you mete out, you also will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you. And why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye, but do not consider the plank in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me remove the speck from your eye, and yet there is a plank in your own eye? Hypocrite. First remove the plank from your own eye, and then you will be able to see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Judge not, lest ye be judged. Jesus seems to infer that if you run around judging people, you're going to get judged by God specifically for doing that. So that's kind of interesting. And then he uses this metaphor of the plank and the speck of sawdust, and I think there are kind of two things in it. First, just the obvious that you still have stuff. You still have stuff in your eye. You still have stuff in your life. You still have stuff to work on. I have stuff to work on. So, maybe that says to us, be a little careful about how high and mighty you are, your judgments on other people, because you still have stuff, And second, you think you're making these perfect judgment calls about other people, because that's how we are when we get judgy, right? We're just so sure. I am. You think you're making these perfect judgment calls about other people, and you don't even realize that something is actually messing with your vision, that you're not seeing clearly. You're like, because when you're in the judgy mode, you say, I'm seeing exactly clearly, and I'm going to tell you what it is, right? And Jesus says, hey, this might be a thing still, So, and this is actually the really interesting question to me. What is it that's messing with our vision? What are the things that mess with our vision? So we really actually aren't discerning things that clearly. And I think there's some really interesting insight into this all the way back in Genesis chapter 3, which is, are you ready for this? The very first place in the Bible where we see human beings judge each other. So I want to read it to you and then think about it together. So you probably know the picture in Genesis chapter 3. The picture is that the man and the woman are living in the garden, and they're knowing the love of God, and they're living in the gifts of God. They're living life exactly the way you want to. Everything is good. Everything is good. I mean, how often have you thought, like, just for 5 minutes, could everything be good, right? Everything is good. And they can pretty much do whatever they want, which I think sounds awesome. I always have this picture, like, what do you want? You want to pick some more fruit? You want to go lay by the stream and take a nap in the sun? Like, what do you want to do today, right? They can pretty much do whatever they want, except God says this one tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you can't eat from that tree. And the serpent comes to them and he says, God's not as good as you think. He's holding out on you. He knows if you eat from that tree, you're going to be like him. He doesn't want you to be all the way like him. He's thrown you a few bones, but he's not that good. And so if you want more, you need to eat from the tree. And, so all they've known is love. Can you imagine? Just think about that for a minute. No, you can't imagine. You can't imagine. All they have known is love. And now that love is doubted, and it creates a question, a void, if you will, and they eat the fruit, and this is the scene that is described afterwards. And then they heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and Adam and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord among the trees of the garden. And then the Lord God called to Adam, and he said to him, Adam, where are you? And so Adam said, I heard your voice in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid myself. And the Lord God said, who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree of which I commanded that you should not eat? And then the man said, this is where it really gets good. I have to dramatize it. And then the man said, was the woman. It was the woman. And then he says this. He blames the woman. Then he blames God. He says, the woman you gave me. You gave me that woman, and now look what's happened, and this whole thing has come tumbling down. And the Lord God said to the woman, what is this that you have done? I think he was like, we'll talk about that later, Adam. He turns to the woman, he says, what is this you have done? And she uses the second oldest trick in the book. The devil made me do it. It was the serpent. It wasn't me. Now, we've always have this idea about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that it's just like a test, like the tree of testing. Like, God puts this tree in the garden, and it's like, will they sin or not sin? Deal or no deal, right? Like, what's going to happen, right? But when Adam says he was aware of his nakedness, so he hid, God's logical response is, did you eat from that tree? Why do you even know that? So let me be bold and rename the tree for you. It's not the tree of testing. And it's not the tree of the knowledge in the sense that we think of that. I would call it's the tree of the awareness of good and evil. The inference in Genesis 3 is that prior to eating from the tree, they never eat or what was bad. Wasn't a question. There was a flow of love from God to them. There was a grateful flow of love from their hearts back to God, and there was an organic, natural flow of love between them for each other. And everything moved around an axis of love, and there was never any idea of a scale of good or bad upon which everything had to be evaluated and decided. In fact, the relationship that God has with Adam and Eve is very much like how we talk about the relationship within the Trinity. It's perfect love. It's love flowing this way and this way and this way and this way. It's love from God to them to God, them to each other. Now watch what happens. All of a sudden, Adam is aware that something is off. He's falling short. He's naked. What he does is he blames Eve. Eve knows that something is off, and now she finds herself under an accusation from Adam, right? And so she blames the serpent. I think we all know that when God stepped in the garden, he already knew what they'd done. When he says, Adam, where are you? What have you done? He already knows the answers to those questions. What God is looking for is a confession, an admission. He just wants them to say yeah, it was dumb. And then God would have said okay, so let's fix it. Let's do what we need to do here. But he doesn't get that. He doesn't get that admission, that confession. What happens is the devil judges God, Adam judges Eve, and Eve judges the devil. Genesis 3 is a story telling us the story of our lives. This is the cycle that we are caught in. Just like Adam, we have shame. We're afraid that we don't measure up. We're walking through life naked, and we're afraid that we're going to be found out. So we rationalize the way that we are. We blame, it's not my fault. It's not my fault, it's that woman, it's those people over there. And we judge others so that we will feel better about ourselves. I think most of that, quite frankly, for us, that last thing, is subconscious. But I don't think it's any different, really, than when you were on the playground when you were 9 years old. When you and your friends put another kid down, said they were weak, said they were stupid, said she wasn't pretty. You suddenly felt a whole lot better about yourself and the group you belonged to. This is the game of the knowledge of good and evil. We've been taught that Adam and Eve ate from the tree and they learned the difference between good and evil. They most certainly did not learn the difference between good and evil, or they wouldn't have immediately perpetrated evil upon each other. What they got hold of was the awareness that good and evil are even a thing, and then in their shame and fear, listen, they began to leverage those categories on each other. And that's what Jesus steps into when he comes into the world. A world where out of our inadequacy we are rationalizing our actions and reassuring ourselves by blaming and judging other people. Religious people, of all people, have made an art form of this. I mean, it's kind of a natural setup because religion says, here's all the good stuff, here's all the bad stuff. We have this propensity of sizing everybody up this way and making ourselves feel better by we're the good people, we're in the good group, or we're whatever, and those are the bad people and they're doing the bad things. We already have this. Now give us these really clean categories of good and evil in religion, and man, we make a stinking art form out of this thing. You hear it when Jesus confronts the Pharisees about standing on the street corners in their robes to pray publicly, if you've ever read that in Matthew's gospel, right? Because they're saying, we're the people who really, we feel good about ourselves because we're the holy people. We're close to God. All those other people, not so much. And you hear it when the religious leaders quote the Sabbath law to justify their disdain for the people Jesus just healed. Over and over in the Gospels, Jesus heals people. Have you ever thought about that? We always hear, and so on the Sabbath day, Jesus went in the synagogue and he healed a guy, or it's on the Sabbath day, he's out on the street and he heals a guy. I think Jesus is doing this on purpose. Like, I think he probably walked by a guy on Friday and said, see you tomorrow. Because I got an argument I need to have with some people about some religion. And so basically, Jesus is healing people. He's restoring people. But those people that he's healing, they're common people. They're sinful people. They're disdained people. And so the Pharisees are saying, oh, see, you did it on the Sabbath. See? And so our disdain for these people is justified. And now we can say that because you participated in that, you're bad too. And not that we've ever heard or seen anyone these days in our time quote the Bible to prove how terrible someone is. But you understand that the religious leaders in Jesus' day had a verse for everything. If you'd have gone to them in any of those stories and said, chapter and verse on this Sabbath ruling here, they'd have said, let me tell you something, brother, it's biblical. There's no healing on the Sabbath thing. This is biblical. And this guy's bad. And he's under the judgment of God. They had a verse for everything. One of my favorite stories is in Matthew 9, where the Pharisees see Jesus eating with a house full of what Matthew describes as sinners and tax collectors. So basically, all kinds of disreputable people. And the Pharisees see this, and they pull some of Jesus' disciples aside. See, they don't go to Jesus, because they know, that's probably not going to go so well. So they pull the disciples are more vulnerable. They pull some of the disciples specifically aside, and they say, hey, why does your master eat with these kinds of people? And they're like, what? Jesus? He's always doing this kind of stuff. I don't know what they said. But when Jesus gets wind, this is how Matthew unpacks it. When Jesus gets wind of that side conversation, he goes and finds them. He looks the Pharisees in the eyes and he quotes Hosea 6:6. This is what he says to him. Hey, do you guys know the verse? I desire mercy, not sacrifice. And then he says this to him. Go learn what that means. And what he's really saying is, I desire mercy toward people, not your judgmental religion toward people. Have you ever noticed that the Christians who are the busiest judging other people, and I've been that guy in years past, long time ago, I was that guy. But the Christians who are the busiest judging other people are also the ones who view God as always kind of this close to dispensing his judgment on people. They might know the word grace, but what they always seem focused on is judgment and sin. Judgment and sin. You go to church and the preacher quotes all kind of Bible verses to make sure you understand that if you want to stay good with God, you got to do this, and you got to do this, and you got to do this, and you got to do this. It's a sad thing that sometimes when I'm out in public, I write my sermons in coffee shops a lot of times. It's great because you can have a nice iced latte and, work on your sermon. It's good. And oftentimes I'll hear other Christian conversations happening in a coffee shop, right? And it's sad that when I hear that, if it's a conversation where two people are sitting at a table talking, and someone in that group or among those people, every other sentence is a Bible verse, I almost always know this is a judgment-oriented Christian. They got a verse for everything, and a verse and a verse. And if I listen close to the conversation, eventually that's where the conversation goes. They start talking about how bad the culture is, how bad people are, how bad all the sinners are out there. They might even start talking about specific groups of sinners. Shouldn't be that way when we talk about the Bible, but there's this mentality that this is how we use it. And what that means to me is this. I've started to say it this way to people. We've taken this beautiful good news of the love of God, wild, audacious love of God. Let's talk Bible. That just dances across the New Testament. And we've turned it back into another law. We sound just like Pharisees. We've turned it back. Thank you, Tim. We've turned it back into another law. So let's talk Bible. I get hung up on Bible verses from time to time. Like I get a verse in my mind and my heart, and it plays in me like a broken record for a while. And it's usually God kind of like saying, like, I really want you to get this and get this and get this, right? So here's a verse I've been stuck on for a while. Some of you are probably going to say, oh yeah, you've brought that up lately. But I want you to hear it. It's a great verse to kind of really just let sink in deep. It's Galatians 3:21. And my translation of it goes this way. If a law had been created that could make new human beings out of people, literally what Paul says is impart life. If a law had been created that could impart life to human beings, then everything would have been restored by the law. Now, Paul's talking about the Old Testament law, but you understand, this is a principle. You could put any set of rules in there. You could even take what you've extrapolated out of the New Testament, all kinds of commands that you think everybody better keep or else they're under the judgment of God, and you can make a law out of that, and Paul's still going to tell you the same thing. No law, no rules, no commandments, no regulations have ever been created that can make a new human being out of a person. They can sometimes tell you what's good and what's bad, but they don't change people. They don't change people. Which I guess is a long way of saying we need something in our Christian lexicon, in our gospel lexicon, we need ideas other than judgment and sin. Because Jesus says, I came that you might have life. How do you get the life? The rules, the law, they can tell you maybe where you're blowing it, but how do you get the life? Now, there's one other thing. I want to take a little side road for a couple of minutes. I want to talk about something that's somewhat unique to this modern moment in the church. Because you understand, there's all these people in our culture who are saying this whole Christian thing is just too judgmental. I'm not attracted to it. If I've been a part of it in my life, I'm not sure I want to be a part of it anymore. Like, this is a lot of people feeling this way. And there is something particular about this moment that's fueling that even more. And I just want to take a side road because I think it needs to be said. A lot of Christians in our time think and have been talking about the idea that because America has gone down so many terrible roads, the job of Christians now is, and you've heard this phrase, to quote, take America back for God. And this has become a common sentiment among modern Christians. And when people first started saying that, maybe in the 80s or the 90s, it didn't seem like that big a deal. But then the idea grew and grew among Christians, and preachers started saying it louder and louder. And now in its full bloom, what it looks like is Christians and Christian politicians doing, I think, two things. Openly advocating the idea of Christian nationalism and openly disdaining groups of people that they see as obstacles to their ideal Christian America. And depending on the moment and the person and the whatever, those groups might be Muslims, gay people, people who hold a different position on abortion than they do, immigrants, it could be anybody. And now you can sort through all those issues for yourself. I'm not here to talk about immigration or, whatever. Those are not my point. But if you can show me the agenda to take America back for God by force in the New Testament, I am all ears. But what I remember Jesus saying was, go and preach the good news to every creature. Are you with me? Everybody with me on this? Like Jesus says, go, this is good news. The good news of the kingdom is going to change everything. This is what people need to know. This is what people need to hear. This is what needs to happen in their hearts. And I think it's worth saying that historically, we already know where Christian nationalism goes. And if you think I'm bringing that up and I'm being an extreme or whatever, there are Christian politicians in America today openly advocating with that verbiage for Christian nationalism. It's like, this is where we need to go. This is what we need to do. So, but we already know historically where that goes. We've seen it in medieval Europe, and we've seen it in Nazi Germany. It ultimately leads people to using the name of Christ to oppress and kill their enemies. That's its logical conclusion. Because what it does is it says, it disavows Jesus' advice to us not to take up the sword. This started really in the 4th century, in early Christianity, where in the time of Augustine, when Christianity, instead of being persecuted, actually was made the state religion of the Roman Empire. And the Christians said, wow, now we can get everybody to behave. We can even make everybody become Christians. All we got to do is pick up the sword and tell them you better. And then for 1,000 years, that was medieval Europe, is Christians with swords, killing other people. And so we already know where this goes. And Jesus has already said to us, those who live by the sword shall die by the sword. You know, Pilate says, why don't your disciples fight? Jesus says, because it's not that kind of kingdom. It's not from this world. It's not what you're thinking of. And maybe that's just a good way to get back to a reasonable place to land this sermon. Because that sounds just like what Jesus told us to do, right? Go out and judge everyone and take power over them, and if they resist your ideology, use force. I know that when I say that, it sounds ridiculous, right? That's the point. Is Jesus has never said anything like that to us. No, at the heart of the good news is a God who came to us not with the sword, but laying his life down, giving himself for us so that this radical, audacious love would become our new home, a new resting place for us, the reassurance that we are okay, that we do have value, and that this love would awaken us and shake us out of the game where we use the concepts of good and evil as leverage to make ourselves feel powerful and important, and use judgment and blame to push others down. Jesus intends to shake us out of that game. And I know, even as I say that, I was working on this last little part of my sermon early this morning. And I thought, it occurred to me what the problem is with that. When you say, so Jesus, he wants his love to wake us up to what we're doing to each other, basically, and change it. One problem. We have to realize that that's what we're doing to each other. Which means we have to become self-aware. And a lot of people aren't. A lot of people jump on judgment bandwagons and don't really realize what it's doing for them, that it is making them feel important, just like it did on the playground, that it is making them feel higher and somebody else lower. And they don't know that. They're not self-aware enough yet to know the motives of their own heart. I'm describing myself in my 20s and my early 30s, by the way. And then I had a bit of an epiphany where I made a very big mistake. I asked God to show me the motives of my heart. Like in a big way. I said, I guess I'm blind to a lot of stuff inside me, so why don't you show me the motives of my heart? It's a very dangerous prayer. And I'm not trying to judge people who aren't self-aware. I'm just saying, if you want to hear Jesus' word on this, and you want love to deliver you from the game of leveraging the categories of good and evil over other people. If you want to do that, you'll have to become aware of the motives of your own heart. And you say, Pastor Fran, are you telling me that to follow Jesus, I'm going to have to take a journey of self-awareness? I am. Here's what I've learned. And I see it there in Genesis 3, and I see it in the way Jesus puts judgment in his back pocket and instead holds out gracious and merciful love to people. What I've learned is it's almost impossible for us to judge people and love them simultaneously. In the moment. I'm not just talking as concepts generally in your life. In the moment when you have settled into the place of judgment, Adam could not love Eve while simultaneously blaming her. It just wasn't really going to work that way. Because judgment, I can't explain this to you, it seems to block the flow of love. But when we decide not to rush in with judgment, but to really see people, do you know what happens? We start to wonder about people. What has happened to them? What have been the circumstances of their life? How have they been wounded? What do they need? How can we help? Do you know that when I'm judging people, and I do sometimes, and I can be very good at it, by the way. Do you know that when I'm judging people, I'm never asking those questions? That's what I mean by like blocks the flow of love. The judgment mode, those questions are over here. If I suspend judgment like Jesus, put judgment in my back pocket, say I want to move toward people in gracious love, now I start seeing people and I start asking all these questions. And I said, what? This is a man, a woman, a child made in the image of God. What has happened to them? What do they need? How can I help? And do you know what those questions are? Those are the questions of mercy and love. Those are the questions of mercy and love. So I don't know if I've helped you figure this out at all this morning. But I know that a lot of people today are watching Christians, and what they think is that we love judgment more than we love mercy. So thank God that I'm not the center of the Christian faith. And thank God that you all are not the center of the Christian faith. Thank God that the center of this whole thing is Jesus himself. And this is what Jesus said. John 3:17, for the Son of Man did not come into the world to judge the world, but that through him the world might be rescued. That's an amazing thing. We're building something different here at LifeSpring. I hope you sense it, hope you smell it, taste it, know it. Let's build it on that.